Welcome back to the OrtoTech Garage. I'm Keith. Today we're talking brakes. I've got this cool Camry here that needs a set of front brakes. We're going to put some new front brake rotors on it. The client is concerned that she's got brake pulsation, brake vibration, and we're going to walk you through all the steps of how to do the brake job on this car properly, installing new brake rotors, cleaning the caliper slides, lubricating the pins, and all these things. So I'm going to get down to the nitty-gritty on some details on this. I hope you guys can follow along with me. Let's get out in the garage and let's get after it. All right, my friends, here we are in the garage. I've got some things set up for this demonstration. I've got a pair of brake rotors here. I've got a set of brake pads with some of the hardware that came along with the brake pads in the box. And then I laid out a couple of options for tools. I understand you might be limited for tools if you're doing a job like this in your driveway or in your garage. You may have this stuff, so let's just talk about it for a second. I've got a pair of torque wrenches here so we can torque the calipers and the caliper bridges down. We can torque the wheels when we're done. I also have some electric tools here we're probably going to use just to speed the job along a little bit so you're not waiting too much for me to loosen some of these things by hand. 3/8 drive and 1/2-inch drive electric impacts, and I also have my torque wrench in a 1/2-inch drive, a torque wrench in a 3/8 drive. Same thing, I have a couple of manual ratchets in a 1/2-inch and 3/8 drive. And then I've got here a pair of needle nose vice grips that I'm going to use to hold the caliper pin in place while we remove the bolt, and I'll kind of show you what that looks like once we get into it. And I have another set of vice grips here that's a C-clamp type, and I'm a little bit old school. I've been doing this method for a really long time, so it's hard to break old habits, but I like to use this tool to compress the piston. This is not advised for anything that has a phenolic or plastic piston on it. You might see this on some of the Ford products that were out years ago and stuff. Please don't use them on that, but if you have a metal piston, it's okay to do something like this. There's lots of methods for compressing the pistons back into the caliper, and lots of tools out there to do that. I didn't bring them all here. I'm just going to show you the easiest way. If you have a set of these at home, this is great. You can use a C-clamp even, the old style that has a threaded screw on it. And then I've got a couple of wrenches here, 14mm and 17mm wrench, and the same thing, sockets in those same sizes that we can use on these tools. That should be about all we need on this Toyota Camry. They're pretty standard. Let me talk just real quick about torque specs. I know you guys will probably ask me about it. The bolts that hold the calipers on are going to be 25 foot-pounds, and then the bolts that hold the caliper bridges on are 79 foot-pounds. And lug nut torque is actually only 75 foot-pounds in this car, so it just shows you the importance of using a torque wrench on these particular ones. If you over-tighten the lug nuts, you have a better chance of distorting the new rotors that we're going to put on here, and then brake vibration will come back eventually, so we want to make sure we get these torqued on properly and in an even pattern. I've already got the car in the shop and put it on the lift. I know at home that some of you are not going to have a hoist in your garage. I understand that. For ease of filming and ease of working on this vehicle, I put it up on a lift. I'm not going to show you guys how to take these wheels off on the ground. I think you can figure that out. If you can't, you can watch my how to replace a spare tire video. You'll see it in my collection there. I do demonstrate exactly how to do that with the tools that come with the car, using the standard jack and all those things. So if you want to watch that first, you can do that to show you how to get your wheel off and put it back on properly. This is the surface that I want to get cleaned up a little bit. Sometimes they put a coating on these brake discs to keep them from rusting during transit and in storage and things. So I like to make sure the surface that the pads rides on is clean of any debris, foreign material, or any coatings. I usually just spray a little cleaner on a rag, and then you can just kind of wipe these off. Make sure there's nothing on the surface that's going to get embedded in the new pads. You don't have to worry about it being completely spotless. Your first few stops with the new brake pads, you're going to burn a lot of this stuff off anyway, but we don't want to leave all that to chance here. Let's get it cleaned up a little bit. All right, so one thing I should mention, this vehicle has wheel locks on it. There's a little locking key that goes on one of the lug nuts. If you have this type of setup, make sure you grab your wheel lock out of the trunk or glove box, wherever that's kept. And then one other note I wanted to make on here, sometimes these wheel locks can break if you use with impact like this. Now these lug nuts are fairly loose at 75 foot-pounds. I'm not too worried about it. If you're working on something that has a pretty high torque on it, I would recommend you break these loose first with a breaker bar or ratchet. This way you don't shear the internals off of the lug lock. I'm not really worried about on this car. These don't generally have any kind of problem like that. And maybe if you were somewhere where the lug nuts have a tendency to seize if you're in the Midwest or something, a lot of road salt and things. This might be a concern for you, so I just wanted to let you know about that. And I do like to take this one off first while the rest of the lug nuts are tight. Just rotate that around until it's in place, and then if you're going to use a tool like this, just make sure you push in on it. You don't want it to come out and strip that wheel lock at all while you're using a tool, especially like an impact like this, because this can be problematic if you have something pop out and strip on it. So that came off no problem. Let's get the rest of them off. Take the wheel off. So here you can see the brake components. We've got a brake caliper here. This piece is a separate piece. We call it the caliper bridge, the brake disc, and then that's all we need to access on this particular brake job. This is going to be pretty straightforward. I should mention that I usually loosen the brake reservoir cap just a little bit to help let some air out. Once we push these pistons back in, we're going to be forcing some fluid back into the calipers. And I also wanted to make mention of another thing. When we're pressing these pistons in, sometimes if you've got like really dirty brake fluid, it's really a good idea maybe pinch off the brake line with a clamp off tool, open the bleeder, and maybe push some of that dirty fluid out the caliper bleeder screw instead of pushing it back up into the system. So that's only if your brake system is pretty dirty. Otherwise, you're really not going to have a problem with it. This brake fluid is very clean on this particular vehicle today, so I'm not really worried about it at all. But if you have one that's looking nasty, the last thing you want to do is force a bunch of dirty brake fluid back all the way up into the system, all the ABS components and things like that. These have a tendency to collect some sediment and things in them, and if you've got a vehicle like that, don't force it back into the system. We want to get that stuff out of there. All right, the first thing we need to do is remove both of these caliper bolts. They're threaded into this pin that goes all the way through. This pin is lubricated, so it's going to want to spin once you break it loose. There is a nut on here that's difficult to reach generally with a wrench. So if you'll take a look at this 17 millimeter wrench, it doesn't really fit in there properly. It's not wide enough. And that's what these vice grips are for. So if you need it, I'll usually take a pair of these and then just clip them in right here. They don't have to be very tight. That's usually enough just to hold that steady while we take this out. This way you don't need a slimline wrench or something in there. That just requires a whole another set of tools that you got to buy. Then we're going to rotate this counterclockwise and just crack it loose. It shouldn't be all that tight. It's 25 foot-pounds, and you'll see these kind of come out by hand once you've got it loose. And like I said, I'm going to try the other side without this. You might not even need it. Let's take a look and see how this one goes. So no problem, we didn't have to use it. Just wanted to let you know if it was a little tight how you could get that off without it spinning on the inside. All right, so this caliper now should come off fairly easily. And I usually just like to come up here and rest it up here. Just be careful not to pinch this ABS line. You don't want to damage that or anything. And then we can take these brake pads out. They come out pretty straightforward. I'm just going to wiggle them out. There's your inboard pad. And this one is your outboard pad. Okay, and you can see where the caliper sits on these little spots. We're going to lubricate those on the new one. Let me show you this inboard pad again. This one has a little ring here. We're going to lubricate those spots where you see that wear on there. So the next thing we can do is we can change these little brackets that are on the caliper bridge. We're just going to pop them off with a screwdriver, and we want to match them up. They're going to be different. There's two different styles depending on which side you put them on. So I'll show you what they look like. Okay, you want to make sure they have little springs on them. These actually hold the pads in place and keep them from rattling. That's what these little springs are for. All right, guys, so here's the new hardware that came with the brake pads. This little spring retainer pushes on the pads. It keeps them from rattling as the brake discs are rotating in there. Stops some noises and vibrations. And all you have to do is just squeeze them down until they seat here in the caliper bridge. And like I said, there's two different styles depending on where they go. You'll know when you try to put it in. There's a high side and a low side. If you can look here, you see this side is a little bit higher than this side. They really only go in one way. The spring clip is going towards the inside of this brake rotor. So let's go ahead and put these all in place. We'll put this one on this side. And they do have these little tabs. I don't know if you can see them here. Right there and right there. and they're going to grab onto this little metal bracket. All right, let's put this last clip in place. Now you just want to make sure they're all seated flat in here, and you'll know if they're not. You won't be able to get the new pads in when we go to install them, but those are installed now. Some guys like to put a little grease underneath them. I don't really think it's necessary. They should be fine there. There shouldn't be a whole lot of movement in them. If they're rattling around, you've got another problem, so we don't want to do that. These are the caliper slide pins, and if you look at, did you notice that this was a little bit tight? If I try to turn it, it's pretty stiff, and if I pull out that way on it, it's kind of hard, and then all of a sudden they got loose. Did you see that? So now it's pretty easy to move, and this is the way they should move. If the caliper can't move back and forth in here, you're going to wear the pads unevenly. You might even have some issues with brake pull. So I always want to make sure these are free when we do a brake job. Even better than that, if you can pull them out, clean them off, put some new lube on them and put them back together, that usually works better. So this just little dust boot on here clips on a groove right there. You can pull this thing all the way out. You don't want to mix these pins up. Sometimes they're completely different. They'll fit in the holes, but one has the O-ring seal on it here, and one might not, like this one. So you see how they're different? So the one with this O-ring on it is going to sit back in the bottom, and this one sits up top. So maybe we'll just leave them separate while we do this demonstration. I'm going to wipe this off. I'm going to use some of that Ceramolube on here, and we'll get them lubed up nice and put it back together. So I've wiped off the grease on there, and then I'm just going to use some of this lube, and I'm going to put a thin coat along this whole pin. We don't want this to get rusted inside the caliper bridge at all, and then we definitely don't want it to seize. You can see it was already starting to bind up. This car's probably got about 35,000 miles on it, and I don't think it's ever had a brake job. So not really a big deal. That's pretty normal. But I like to put a little liberal amount of lube on there and then stick it back in that rubber boot there. If you're not careful, this boot can come off completely. It's not a big deal. It just kind of hooks on almost like it does on this side. So you can just work it back on and then put it together. But you see how nice that went back in, and then you want to just kind of work this little boot back where it belongs. So I usually just twist it, and now it's back in that groove that I showed you earlier, and this should move freely back and forth, okay? And then let's do the same thing with this other one. Just get this cleaned up. And these usually call for some sort of a lithium-based grease on there. This Ceramolube is really made for brake parts, and it works really well. I've been using it for, I don't know, a really long time without any problems. So we're going to shove that back in there. See how that one clicked back into the boot? Wipe that off, and you can see it's seated all the way against the top of the bolt head, okay? So now we can pull off this caliper bridge so we can change the brake disc. We're going to use our 17mm socket, and we're going to use a 3/8 drive ratchet. These bolts are going to be pretty tight at 79 foot-pounds, so it's going to take a little work to get these off. We'll go ahead and break these loose and see how bad I sweat. Not too bad. Another thing I recommend you do, don't take this bolt out all the way until you get the other one loose. Sometimes it can be pretty tight, and if you take the bolt out all the way, this bridge will actually try to rotate, especially if you're going the opposite direction on the other side. It's going to want to lift this thing all the way up and try to hit you in the face. So leave these two bolts in here. Don't take them all the way out until you've got them both completely loose, and that'll save you a little bit of grief, okay? And because these bolts are not rusted in or anything, they're coming out fairly easy. So then you see how loose this is. Definitely want to hold that with one hand. When we take these bolts out, see how this wants to flop? That's what I was trying to tell you before. If you do that on the other side and you took the bottom bolt out first, it might flip up and hit you in the face while you're trying to break that other bolt loose. We don't want that to happen. There's your caliper bridge. Hopefully you can see that. And we're ready to take the brake rotor off. We're trying to take this brake rotor off. It's a little bit stuck on here. As you can see, you can wiggle on it and you can kind of tap on it a little bit and it's not popping free. This is not abnormal. Sometimes this happens. It's going to add a little bit of extra to the tool. We might need to get this off, so we're going to add a couple tools to that collection I showed you earlier. Should be all stuff you probably have in your home toolbox, just hammers. But I wanted to mention a couple of things about this in case this scenario is much worse for you at home. If you live in the Rust Belt somewhere, this could be seized on extremely badly. It could be rusted completely to the hub. And I've had some that were so bad, I've had to use an oxyacetylene torch to cut them off the car. Hopefully that's not the case for you. These I can tell you for sure, just a light tap with a hammer is going to pop them free. I'm going to give you a couple of choices here, tool to use, depending on what you're doing. If you're going to be replacing the brake rotors, like I am today, it doesn't matter what you do to this rotor. You can beat it senseless with a hammer. It's going to go in the trash anyway. If you're trying to resurface these brake rotors, you're going to bring them to your local auto parts store to resurface them for you. You don't want to be hitting this with a big heavy hammer. Here's the proper choice. If you can see this, I've got a dead blow hammer. This is designed to hit with a little less severe impact and not bounce back so much either, so it's not going to bounce off of this as easily. This is much easier, much gentler on the rotor, and you can certainly work your way around it. Instead of giving one giant, big, heavy blow to it, you can kind of pop it around. Or you can just use a fairly decent sized hammer, something with some weight to it. 1 or 2 pops should knock this thing free. If you're going to discard them, this might be my choice. If you're going to reuse them, this might be the choice. I'm going to use this because this might take a little extra work, and you should see how easy it comes off. And if for some reason it's going to make a fool of me, I'm going to use this hammer. Let's get after it. All right, so I hope you saw how easy that came off with the dead blow hammer. Take this rotor off the vehicle and then discard it, machine it, whatever you want to do. With that dead blow hammer, we haven't done any damage to the surface. You won't have any impact marks, and hopefully it didn't distort it any worse than it was already. These rotors are pretty warped on here. That's why we're putting new ones on, and they're just not worth resurfacing. So here's another thing I want to mention to you. If you've got some rust built up in here on this hub, you need to clean it off. So a good tool to use that is some sort of a wire wheel or a grinding disc a little bit. If this flange here is not flat and smooth, you got a little rust buildup on it, the rotor won't sit flat on it, and you're going to have a brake vibration right out of the gate. Don't give yourself that opportunity to fail that early. You want to make sure that this is very clean and smooth. Likewise, if you're not replacing the brake discs, if you're having them resurfaced, the inside of the hub of the brake disc also needs to be clean. So you need to get in there and grind on that a bit and make sure that mating surface to this flat part of this hub looks equally clean to this hub. So make sure you do that if you have some rust. I just like to take a little cleaner, spray a tiny bit on here, just make sure there's nothing loose, some debris or something on this hub, and then just give it a little wipe down. Let's make sure it's nice and clean. And then we're ready to put our new brake disc on here. After we get that cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and use some of this cleaner on the new disc. All right, I'm going to put this brake disc on. One thing I didn't mention to you, that these brake discs do have these threaded holes in them. I don't know if you can see them there from the picture, but they are threaded with an 8mm thread pitch on it, 8 by 1.25. And if you're having trouble getting these brake discs off, you can put a bolt in here and tighten against this flange, and that'll usually help you pull them a little bit in conjunction with tapping it a bit with a hammer. We obviously didn't need to do that on this one. That's for ones that are stuck pretty hard. And I do like to line them back up. You'll see the marks on the flange there. I like to line them back up the way they were. And then I usually put a lug nut on by hand, and that keeps this rotor from doing this. It's a little hard to work on it when it's dangling like that. So if you just push it up flat, give it a little wiggle, and then take your lug nut, you'll notice just that's enough to hold this thing in place. It's going to make installing our brake caliper and brake caliper bridge really easy. We've got these brake pads we pulled off of this side. You saw me take them off before, but I want you to notice that they are definitely different on these shims. These are the factory shims that came with this car. You have a couple of options at this point. These brake pads that I've got here are a set of Advix pads. They're the same brand of brake rotor, and it's certainly a good alternative for these, but you notice the shims look a little bit different. This is not really a concern, but I just wanted to let you know you have some options. If you wanted to peel these shims off and put the factory shims back on, you can. So I want to show you something on here. These wear indicators that came with these brake pads, they look similar, but they are not the same. If you notice here, the way they mount on the brake pad, this is much wider here than this one. So I don't want to put these on the pad. It's not going to work properly. We're just going to pop these off of the other one, and then we'll just swap them out, okay? Just remember which side they went on. Of course, once we get it back lined up like this, it'll be on that side. So this is going to go here. Take that off, and then we'll just put it on this one. It has a little bit of a slot in here, and that's why I don't want to use the other ones. These have a thinner mounting bracket, and this is what you want to use on here instead. It's okay to reuse these as long as they're not worn. If they wear out, they probably won't be very effective next time to indicate the brake pads are worn. So that's how they should look. This one just overhangs too much on this shape that they've got on this brake pad, so I don't know how those ended up in the box with these, but no reason you can't reuse the other ones. They're just there to indicate that brake pads are low. Same thing on the other one. There we go. And we'll put this one on this side. Okay, so now we got the one there and the one here. This is going to be for our inboard pad, the one that has the piston shape on it. This is going to be for our outboard pad, the one that has the caliper marks on it. Okay, so this is a good time to take a little dab of your brake grease and then apply it where you see those marks on there. So very thin. We don't want to do a lot on here. And then thin here. Now there's also some brake grease that came with these. You can use either one of these. It's not that important. This, like I said, this particular lube is good for all these brake parts. So go ahead and use that on there. Maybe just take a little bit of excess off. We don't want it to get hot and run anywhere. Just a tiny bit is enough to stop some of the squeals and vibrations you might get. I need a little lubricant between the parts. Let's go ahead and put these on the car. We need to reinstall our caliper bridge before we can put these pads on. Just slide this thing over the brake caliper. Over the rotor. And then we're going to line up our bolts. I probably have to peek in your way here for a second so I can see. And wiggle that around so you catch some threads. Same thing on the top bolt. Just give it a little wiggle. You'll feel the threads catch on there. And you can run these all the way in by hand. Your car you might not be able to if you had a lot of rust. Might need to use your ratchet. Just make sure you get it in a couple of turns before you use the ratchet. You don't want to cross thread any bolts. And then I'm going to snug that up with our ratchet and then we'll torque it. The torque wrench is set to 79 foot-pounds. Let's give it a little click. Let's install our brake pads. Again, the one we put the circle pattern of the grease on is going to go on the inboard pad. I usually like to start with this side first. It's got a little bit of spring tension on it, so it's easier to push this side up into that bracket that we installed, and then the other side can follow over here. These can be a little bit tricky sometimes, so you just got to fight it a little bit and get it in there. Okay. So we've got inboard pad installed. Let's put our outboard pad on. Same process. You're going to fight these little springs a little bit. You want to push the tension in this way against that as you drop that pad in. Okay. Now in that kit they gave me some spring that go in between the pads. They don't work on these particular pads. So obviously the hardware kit that they gave me with that brake pad is a little bit different. Doesn't work with these. Sometimes they just overload you with hardware, or they give you the wrong hardware. You reuse whatever you can from the old stuff. That is okay, as long as it's not rusted or anything. If you see any damage, if the springs are bent or if it's rusted, then obviously you have to discard that stuff and put some new items on it. So see what comes in the box with your stuff. If you don't have what you need to go out to the parts store and get the right stuff. So I want to compress this piston right now. I told you I'm going to use this tool. There are a lot of tools out there. I also told you I really like this method. Been using it for a long time. In the event you have a plastic piston or something that you want to protect a little, and you don't want to press directly on the inside of the piston cup with this, just put a brake pad on here, and you can do the same method by opening this up even wider and just kind of pressing on the brake pad. Okay, this particular piston, it's not going to hurt at all. What I'll usually do is just kind of run this thing in until I have a little bit of tension. You don't want to do the whole thing all at once. I do this in steps, and then I just give it a little bit of a squeeze, nice and slow. And it's going to slowly retract that piston. It's starting to push it in. Once that stops, I loosen it up and I tighten another turn or so, and then I bring it in and just kind of repeat this process a couple of times. You'll see this little boot in here sometimes wants to fill up with air. Okay, so just kind of wiggle a little bit. I'm going to show you here. This boot right here, it starts to fill with air, and you just need to kind of wiggle it around a little bit and get it tucked back in. And we don't want this sticking out and contacting the pad. I'm actually going to, if that'll stay there, I'm going to grab a little screwdriver and I'll show you what we need to do. So if this is sticking out, you could get it pinched in between your brake pad and this piston on here. So we definitely want to make sure that it works its way all the way back in. And this one's going to give you a little bit of trouble here. It's got a lot of air in it. I just want to try to work it in without putting a hole in the boot. Just tuck it. And if this doesn't work, you can also, there's a little lip in here, just let some of the air out. And then tuck it in the rest of the way. Okay, it should sit flat when you're done below the surface of the brake pad. Okay, still got a little bit of air in there. Just let some more out. Okay, there's just a little seal under here. All I'm doing is picking it up just a little bit to let some of that air out of this boot. Okay, so now it sits flush all the way around, and we put our brake pad in, it'll ride smoothly on this piston cup. Okay, and then just check it one more time. It should be all the way in. Okay, it's not moving in anymore. That means we're seated and we're ready to put this back together. So we're ready to drop this on here. One of the common problems we see is when you put this caliper on, this brake hose from here to here should be nice and smooth, not all twisted. So sometimes when people do their brake job at home and they do what I did and they put it up this way, they try to get it all twisted and cockeyed like this. If you can see, that brake hose is all twisted up, and then they try to put it back on the car, and if you stretch it hard enough, it'll actually fit. It's not easy to do, but we see it quite often. Sometimes people aren't paying attention and they just jam that thing on there. We want to make sure this brake hose is sitting nicely with no kinks in it. Okay, and then you can just slide this into place now that you have your piston retracted. Okay, move these little pins in a little bit, just push them in so they bottom, and then you'll see that sits on there nice, and we're ready to put our caliper bolts on. Wiggle it around, get them started, a couple of threads. Okay, if you can run them in by hand, by all means you can do that. So we snug this bolt up. This one will go snug. And this one, I don't know if you can see, it wants to spin and turn. It won't tighten because the pin is turning. And this is what I was talking about in the previous section, is that I use those needle nose vice grips to hold this inner piece. The needle nose part of it fits in there nicely. You can clamp it on there, and then you don't have to worry about it spinning so much. It doesn't require a lot of grip to hold it. You just hold it and then it'll snug up, okay? So I'll leave that on there while we torque those two bolts to 25 foot-pounds. So we'll hold this. We're just going to give it a little torque and we should be good. Okay, and then this one was not turning, so we're probably good without it. 25 foot-pounds. I want to give you one more little trick before I wrap this up. Sometimes these brake discs will get a big lip on them, and you'll have trouble getting the caliper off without compressing it first. So one little thing that I'll do is I'll take some sort of a screwdriver like this, and I put it in this hole, and then you can actually just pry off of this part of the caliper against the brake rotor on this side, and it'll actually compress that piston for you. So you can just kind of pull it gently like this, and you're prying on the brake disc itself and on the caliper. And by pulling it towards me, it's going to push that piston in, it's going to bring this caliper over a little bit, and that's going to give you enough room so that you can get this caliper off of those the brake rotor without it being stuck on there so much. You could actually press this piston in all the way with this method. I've done that before. Not going to hurt anything. Go nice and slow, and work it gently. Again, there's other tools to do this. There's a little ratcheting tool you can put in between the caliper and the brake pad, and you can kind of ratchet it in. There's literally tons of methods to do this. I just showed you two of mine, and one of them should work for you. We're about ready to put this wheel on. We need to take this lug nut back off. Now that we have the caliper and the pads in place, the rotor's not going to dangle around too much and make it easy for us to put the wheel back on. Just not going to get it on there with this lug nut still on the car. Line up your holes there, and then push this flat on the hub and get your lug nuts in there. I like to put at least one on all the way. If I can do it by hand, it makes it nice. These have a interesting lug nut with a big washer, and they sit inside the rim. So it's just easier if you can get this one seated in there. It makes it easier to put everything else together. The wheel will sit flat on the hub, make it nice for you to tighten everything back up. Okay. You can run these in all the way by hand. You can use an electric tool. Either way, once we let this car back down to the ground, we're going to torque it to that 75 foot-pounds. Make sure it's tightened properly and not over-torqued. All right, come in nice and slow. And then the last one is going to be this lock. I do like to run these up by hand for that reason I told you earlier when we took the wheel off. Just make sure you push in on it a little bit, just a little bit of a snug, and then we're going to torque this with the torque wrench. So we're getting ready to torque the wheel on here. I just want to let you know, for sake of speed and efficiency, we went ahead and completed the other side. It's exactly the same to this side. There's really nothing different. And once you're done, you'll torque all your wheels after you let the vehicle down to the ground. I'll show you what that looks like, 75 foot-pounds. And then you want to go ahead and snug these up in that star pattern, a little bit at a time. Okay, double check them. Okay, we're all set there. And a couple things we need to do still. One, we need to pump up the brake pedal. So when you push those calipers in, you've seated them all the way back as far as they go, and they'll probably need to come back out a little bit before you get a brake pedal. The last thing you want to do is hop in this car, close the hood, and go try to drive away. You're not going to have a brake pedal. Your pedal's probably going to go to the floor. So it is super important that you get in there right now, give that brake pedal a couple of nice slow pumps. It's going to feel a little spongy first 2 or 3 pumps, and then it's going to come up and it'll be hard again. That's your indication that you've got your brake pad seated and your caliper is all the way extended back against the pad. Your piston, your caliper, I should say. And then the last thing to do is just double check the fluid. Now guys, it's possible, depending on how much fluid you have in your reservoir when you start this brake job, depending how low your brake pads were, once you push some of that fluid back up into the reservoir in the master cylinder, you might get some spill out over the top. So check the level, make sure it's not overfull, make sure it's not underfull. It should be right at the top of the full level. And then go ahead and clean up your master cylinder, wipe it all down and make sure that there's no brake fluid anywhere, and certainly don't want to get any brake fluid on the car or on the paint. It'll eat your paint pretty quickly, so be real careful with that. Once you've got your brake pedal pumped up and your brake fluid set to the proper level, everything cleaned up, your wheels are torqued, close your hood up, and you're ready for a road test. Go ahead and give it a drive gently. You want to get it through a few heat cycles. Don't go out there and stand on the brake pads. There's going to be some limited stopping distance. When you're done with your brake job here, it's going to take a couple 100 miles at least for them to seat in properly and start to work at full function. So make sure you give them some time to break in. Great job following along on that brake job with me. I hope you guys are really enjoying the content we're bringing you. I want to make sure that you're being extra safe doing your own brake job. If you're not feeling confident doing these type of work on your own, please take it somewhere to a professional, have them handle it for you. But I think you following some of these steps, you guys can easily get along in this job and handle it on your own. And we're going to have another video coming up here for you right here, following up on this brake series with some more brake style information. So make sure you check that out. And I want to thank you all for watching us. It's been a lot of fun putting this content together for you, and I hope it's been informative and somewhat entertaining. And please don't forget to like and subscribe and all those things. Honk that button, get some notifications when we're putting out new content. We'll see you in the next video.